Howdy of you delicious people. Warm bodies. So this is ultimately a what I would call a quasi Valentine's Day film because ultimately usually it seems that the promo packages kind of go into here and have posters of two people and hearts and ultimately when also looking at it, it has something towards the end of the movie where it kind of showcases what actually happens to the zombies of this film, which is ultimately to the point of kind of making to the point of why this movie, why talk about it, and so on and so forth. So, really, in this film, we have really some actors that I think went on to do other things and very much more interesting things. We really have it to where Nicholas Hoult ultimately had gone on to be Beast at some point, who ultimately is playing R in this movie. We ultimately have it to where Teresa Palmer, who ultimately plays Julie, I have seen in the number four and Berlin Syndrome, which ultimately I would suggest for a lot of people to go out of the way to say that they saw at some point. Nora, ultimately, Anneli Tipton, Tipton. Ultimately, I had seen her recently in Crazy Stupid Love, and so ultimately that might have been a pre movie that she had done. But ultimately, I've also seen her in other things. I think the movie, uh, God, I think it's Collision or Concussion or something along those lines. Where ultimately she is, oh my God, I think it's something along those. It sounds like that. I'd probably seen her in a number of other movies as well. Um, I'm probably not going to take the time to actually look it up because it would take forever. Um, but anyways, so we also have Rob uh, Cordy Cordry Cordry Rob Corddry, which ultimately been in a number of Hot Tub Time Machine and a bunch of other comedies. Dave Franco ultimately being in a number of things. Also, recently seeing him in the Disaster Artist, and then also John Malkovich is also being in John Malkovich, Mile 22, any number of things he's been in at the end of the day. So let's go out of our way to ultimately talk about this film. So recently, it's kind of a very simple or simplistic film. We really have it to where there seems to be a zombie that seemingly is the main focal pointed character. He seems to bizarrely have his own narration, and we get a kind of a zombie apocalypse from the viewpoint of the zombie, which I thought was rather interesting. We get to see some stuff in this film that we probably wouldn't be able to normally in any others because ultimately the more focal pointed thing to go into is the survival point of the actual people who are left alive. In this movie, we get a different perspective, and we have it to where a zombie is ultimately trying to go through its day to day life and eventually at some point like meeting his best friend, which ultimately is M or eventually Marcus. And we eventually have this interesting journey where eventually like the common day of a zombie, which ultimately leads to R eventually going and meeting a person named Julie, and eventually goes and tries to otherwise realize that bizarrely he needs to protect her for some reason. He is drawn to her, and ultimately he is ultimately trying to a zombie protect a person. And eventually, it seems that there is a portion of this movie that ultimately is to bizarrely go into the fact that it seemed that this zombie movie is trying to be different than anything else, and also it is trying to also be a love story. And that is the real approach of this movie is to be a love story at the end of the day in a bizarre way because zombie apocalypse. So really, if anything, I really thought that this movie was fun. I thought that this movie was kind of a movie that ultimately, like, it kind of felt a little bit slow, but when also looking at it, it also like if people already love kind of the zombie genre, which ultimately, um, there's so many interesting movies like Dawn of the Dead or ultimately, uh, God, what other things have I even recently just seen? Dawn of the Dead, uh, The Walking Dead. If anything, a comic book fanboys versus zombies is something that I could recommend in the end. And recently, God, there's probably a lot of other zombie things that I've seen, and I'm drawing a blank right now because there's a crap ton of them that I've probably seen. I started watching Reality Z. I started, and there's a number of other freaking zombie movies. And Zombieland, ultimately, I've seen both of those, and I liked the first one, and I could care less for the sequel. And so on and so forth. I think I'm eating a lot of time here because ultimately there's not much to really say about this movie. There's really not much to even go into in the spoilers about this film. So I'm just kind of concerned of how long this review is actually going to take. Because this is a very simple movie. It's either um, you're going to like it, like at the end of it all, or you're just gonna like, yeah, like I just found this movie to be boring, or I just found this movie to just kind of like uh be like it's an interesting zombie movie, but that's about it. Like it kind of feels one of a kind out of the zombie genre, but there's not much else besides that ultimately really goes and draws from to say like, yeah, I'm gonna say this about this movie. So speaking of that, let's go into break down this movie. Ultimately, yeah, recently I feel like this movie is like an adaptation from something, and I could be wrong about that, but it feels like it could have been adapted from somewhere. But anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we ultimately have our right away in this movie kind of giving us a day to day, really telling us that of course through every single zombie movie they don't really care what happened to get us to that point. Really, we have it to where R is ultimately narrating and mentioning how this whole thing started off, and ultimately there's not a real true consensus in his mind of what all started this off to get it to where they are. So we have it to where R is strolling around in this airport, and it seems that at some point that he is unfamiliar with one portion of the airport to where he ends up getting completely and totally lost, and so he ends up kind of like backtracking around to ultimately just going like, where am I going? So eventually, we also find that R ultimately has a best friend that is named M, and it seems that at some point we are finding out in this movie that it seems like zombies can even talk in this movie. It seems like they're getting words out here and there, and so we ultimately have it to where R is to ultimately eventually just kind of stroll around, and ultimately kind of just showcase how this new world is and how things are building up. So we eventually have it to where R is to go off with a gaggle of zombies to go somewhere, and that leads them ultimately to find Julie, Nora, and Perry that are all going into some pharmacy to get a bunch of pills. So we have it to where they're getting all these pills in this pharmacy. I guess they're trying to lock this pharmacy down to make sure that ultimately they can keep coming to this pharmacy consistently. And so we end up having it to where eventually we have zombies eventually breaking in to said pharmacy, and here's where we have these shootouts and everybody's dying and stuff along those lines. We have it to where eventually R eventually kills Perry and eats his brain, well, eats portion of his brain to ultimately save the rest of it for later, bizarrely. I don't really understand that at all, but okay, sure. So I guess for us to get invested in Julie's character, because heaven forbid if you had the zombie eat the whole brain all at one time, that ultimately there would be like so many of these scenes that ultimately you'd have to do in a montaging way all in one shot. Whereas R kind of taking portions of Perry's brain all at some time is giving us like an easier flashback point to all of this stuff at some point. So we end up having it to where R ends up seeking out Julie, and ultimately, as soon as he sees her, but also he's getting flashbacks of Perry. We have it to where seemingly, because bizarrely we had R at some point playing a record player, and before he had gotten to this moment, and he had been enjoying his seemingly airplane at some point that ultimately he got just for him. And so we end up having again R going to see Julie, and we have some music playing in the background, and ultimately R is seemingly in love to the point where he ends up kind of uh, desecrating Julie's face with some kind of zombie-ish like uh, scent of sorts, and we have it to where R is telling Julie to follow him, and so she does. We have it to where Julie and the zombies are all taken to go into uh, the airport. It seemed that Noah had been able to go into some little hideaway hole, and she had been fine. And evidently, all the zombies weren't going to try to kill her. Isn't that great? So we have it to where Julie and R. We have it to where Julie is just kind of like walking normally or whatever, following R uh, to this airport. So we have it to where R is ultimately taking Julie to his airplane and consistently like telling her like what is safe and what is not safe, repetitiously trying to like I'm going to keep you safe kind of thing is what ultimately he tells her. And we have it to where Julie is ultimately at some point saying it's like, well, yeah, but I need things like food. I need to survive. Like I need to like be able to like I need to leave at some point. And we have it to where R is ultimately trying to comfort Julie, put a blanket on her, and while she has a knife on him, like he's putting a blanket on her, he's trying to comfort her, and we have it to where Julie is like, "You are so odd." Like, who are you? What are you? So we have it to where ultimately Julie is to eventually try and escape out of this airplane, and R is trying as much as possible to see where Julie had ran off to, because Julie had realized that all of a sudden zombies are consistently starting to swarm at her, and R ends up trying to again disguise her scent and then have her walk off with him, to the point where eventually R is ultimately like Julie needs to leave, and so R is realizing that, so he is going to help her go into leaving. We also find out that R like we have like these people that look like almost people, and they are called corpses, but we have an escalation of even more like skeleton looking like zombies that are to be like the zombies that have gone so far off the rails that they are just like they will attack whatever, they will do whatever just to get their food, and they are also in this airport as well. So we have it to where eventually M is to see R, and because ultimately we have it to where Julie is to come up with a name for R, because reasonably he doesn't remember what his name is. ultimately she is trying to figure out what it is, but ultimately they never come to a clear consensus of what his name is. So we end up having it to where Julie is making her way through this airport with R, and eventually at some point we have it to where M is just like living, living, eat, like living, eat, and we have it to where eventually some of the skeleton zombies are making their way to Julie because they smell her, and so we have it to where ultimately we have these skeletons that are coming onto their way, and but M is going to eventually help them out regardless because M and R are best friends. I guess that what ultimately makes them Mister. It's ridiculous. So we end up having M, who ends up seeing all of these skeleton zombies all collected outside of this airport, and he rams them over with this vehicle, and he ultimately tells them to get in because ultimately they can't actually speak normally. So we have it to where eventually R and Julie end up going to this deserted portion of town where ultimately Julie knows all full and well um, that ultimately her father would normally be sweeping through this area to find people. And ultimately, she assumes that eventually at some point she is going to be found. But the only problem is that her father has a problem with any kind of zombies. And so reasonably, Julie is trying to figure out how she can rationally try to bring in this zombie to say, hey, there's something different going on with these zombies, and ultimately try to protect R from getting killed because he's just a zombie to everyone else. So we have it to where eventually Julie is, or R or Julie is to ultimately see that there is like a patrol going on where ultimately uh, John Malkovich's character, Grigio. I'm just going to call him John Malkovich. I'm not going to try to even pronounce that name. So John Malkovich is ultimately having a swarm of people going through this town, and ultimately Julie and I think R end up seeing that. So, but we eventually have it to where Julie is to make her way the next day to where their base is, and ultimately they have to check her to make sure that she's not infected. And we ultimately have it to where John Malkovich's character is ultimately finding his daughter and ultimately hugging her. Like, are you sure that you're not infected? We just have to be absolutely sure. So, but like interestingly enough, we had it to where Julie is before she ends up going back to the base. She ultimately goes and has R sleep with her in her room, where ultimately she mentions that her clothes are wet, bizarrely, and so she ends up taking off all of her clothes, and we have it to where R is looking at her, and he's like, mm-hmm, kind of thing. It's like, yeah. And so we have it to where Julie is talking to R, and ultimately, like, they're getting seemingly uh, like a tender moment going on and so on and so forth. So Julie ends up going to the base the next day, and here's eventually where we get to a very romantic-ish like part. It's kind of like Romeo and Juliet all over again. So like star-crossed lovers kind of thing, and it's kind of interesting. So we eventually have Julie go back in the base, and she's met up by Nora, and ultimately, like, they're so happy that she's back and that she had survived, but ultimately, like, they were the only real survivors that were left. So we have it to where eventually R is going out of his way to speak to Julie, yeah, and he is doing it from Julie is off on this balcony, and R is speaking to her from like down by the brush somewhere, and we have it where Julie's like, "Oh my God, you can't be here because my father will kill you," kind of thing, and it's like Romeo and Juliet all over again. And we have it to ours like, but I needed to see you kind of thing, and I needed to see that you're okay, and ba 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 ba. So we go on to have Nora ultimately going out to this balcony to because we have it to where Julie mentions to Nora about the zombie that she had found. That ultimately it seems that this zombie is different, and Nora's like, "Well, okay, that's interesting." Like she is not reporting this. She is not going to do something underhanded and whatever and betray Julie, which I thought was great. So we end up having Nora eventually going out to the balcony and seeing R, and she's like, "Oh, that's the guy you were talking about. Oh, okay." So we end up having R just come into the base secretly, and they otherwise decide to uh, put like a ton of makeup on R. They put him in a shower, they clean him up, and they ultimately put makeup on him to disguise him as a real boy, and so we end up having it to where R is trying to be portrayed as a real boy. Excuse me. And we have it to where R is like walking with these girls and he's trying to like seemingly walk normally. And we have it to where R is talking to people and he's almost sounding quasi like a zombie. Eventually, there's one soldier that ends up stopping them, and we end up having R like when the soldier ends up stopping him. Ultimately, we have R that's ultimately like, "Oh God, what do I say to this guy? How are you doing?" And he's like, "Nailed it." He's like, and then he moves on uh, to ultimately we have it to where Julie is ultimately to like talk to her father and try to like sway him on the fact that ultimately that they have seen a new batch of zombies, and John Malkovich's character will not like believe any of this. It's like, no, like if anything, like their mother had turned into a zombie, and any other zombie is just a zombie. Like you have to kill them all, because we have to survive. And so we end up having it to where Julie is ultimately nothing that she can say is going to work. To ultimately get John Malkovich opinion to be swayed, and so we have it to where R ends up going in and talking to John Malkovich, and ultimately like trying to convey that, hey, like we're safe, we're we're going to like we're here to help kind of thing, and John Malkovich ultimately is going to put a gun to this corpse because to him he's like, you're dead, aren't you? And so ultimately he puts a gun to him, and we have it to where eventually Nora is to put a gun on John Malkovich, and ultimately Julie is to say like this guy is different. These zombies are different. Like we need to like really assess this and figure this all out. While that is going on, we also have M that is seemingly going into this airport and looking at all these pictures. And it seems that while that is going on, he is remembering things. And then all of a sudden, a lot of the other zombies that end up walking next to M to see all these pictures are also like their hearts are changing as well. It seems that M turns to one of the other zombies and is like, "Hey, like, look at that! What, like?" And ultimately, another zombie's like, "Beautiful!" And ultimately, like, that is where you kind of see some of the zombies start to change. So we have it to where now that it seems that the humans are ultimately going to make a run to ultimately take down some more zombies, and so they are to go out there and start to take down a lot of the skeleton zombies. And we find that some of the zombies are ending, or some of the skeleton zombies are killing some of the humans. And we eventually have it to where a lot of the corpse zombies. So I'm going to have to defer to different people. So corpses are people with flesh and whatever. The skeletons are going to be the the extreme zombies. So like So when I say corpse, it's going to be the flesh people. When I say skeletons, it's going to be the different set of zombies. But anyways, because we eventually have it to where when M and the corpses are all having their heart changed, it seems like the skeletons are coming to M, and they smell different. The skeletons, the corpses smell different to the skeletons, and they get very angry and upset. And to where ultimately this is where they want to start a war between these two things. Because we end up having it to where these humans are all going and trying to attack these skeletons, and some of them die, but then eventually we find a corpse that ultimately is to help one of the military guys, and the corpse like grabs onto their hand of like, yeah, we're here to help kind of thing. And eventually we have it to where the military is trying to comb through and try to take out all these skeletons or just normal zombies, and they find out there's a huge batch of zombies that are attacking all the skeletons, and M is ultimately like kind of like the key character that is kind of helping this attack, and kind of we have it to where ultimately all the military guys are ultimately going with the zombies, and we have it to where M is ultimately saying hi, 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 hi. He's like, yeah, like we're coming together to beat all these skeletons. So it seems like the corpses and the military are all working together, and it seems like they're really starting to wipe out all of these zombies. But it seems like at some point when Julie and all of the other military are eventually going to have to like go and fight these things, we end up having it to where eventually, as they're going into the stadium and trying to fight everything out, it seems that eventually Julie and R end up getting painted into a corner where ultimately they have to fall from this top height of the stadium into this water. And so it ends up that ultimately we have it to where R is going to protect Julie by having her fall onto him, so she's protected, because and plus he's already dead anyway, so he can fall and take the he can take the fall where she can't. So eventually we have it to where Julie ends up going and getting out of the water, but R seems to have a problem. So ultimately Julie goes after R and ultimately gets him back out of the water. We have it to where R ends up getting shot by John Malkovich, and ultimately we end up having Julie trying to protect R. It's like, no, like he saved me. He saved me numerous times by now. And no, we are not going to have R be killed. And so we have a lot of reports coming on John Malkovich walkie that the corpses are helping defeat all the skeletons, and John Malkovich is baffled by this report, and he's like, "Are you Are you serious? Can you confirm all this?" And people are confirming it. Like, and John Malkovich thought it was just like, are people insane, or like, are we getting wrong reports? But evidently, like, we have it to where we have John Malkovich who had shot R, and ultimately he says the next one is going into his head. But we find out that R is ultimately bleeding. And so Julie is mentioning, oh my god, like R is actually bleeding. Like he's bleeding. He's human again. And we have it to where John Malkovich is ultimately just like, wait a minute. Okay, that's different. So ultimately, we have John Malkovich calling off the dogs to basically like, hey guys, put your guns down. Like this one's okay, I guess. I don't know why, but all of a sudden, evidently, all the zombies are changing to be human now, or what would be the human equivalent. So we seemingly have everything going good. We have it to where zombies are working with the military force and wiping all the real true zombie problems out. to where eventually they had this big, huge like wall all over the survivors' side, and they end up taking a big ton of dynamite to kill that entire wall. We eventually seemingly have zombies and normal people commingling with one another to the point of um, Marcus ends up having a tough time uh, uh, doing his umbrella, and we have some woman who ends up helping him with an umbrella, and we have it to where Marcus ends up, while this girl's walking off, we have it to where Marcus goes and protects her under the umbrella. And we have it to where Marcus tells her, it's like, you look really pretty. And to where the girl is like, oh, that's nice of you to say. And he goes like, well, that's when you tell me I'm pretty too. And so, like, there's always so many little laughs that ultimately M and or Marcus delivers. Like, ultimately, we have at some point where Marcus is to call out to R and ultimately say, "Yo," like, "Hey, like we're friends," kind of thing, and to ultimately tell R that all the zombies are getting together to help. And so I really enjoy that moment. I kind of skipped over that moment, but there's a ton of like Marcus or M moments that I thought was kind of really interesting and whatever. Like the time when R and Marcus end up going into the portion of airport where they're talking together, where ultimately R says that he's hungry and M says that he's sitting, to where he's basically telling him in one word that it's like hey, you go and eat something, I'm fine. And so that's when R ends up going off to go and eat Perry. And so really, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this review. I didn't think that I'd be able to have all this and it be 30 minutes, so that's great. I really actually like this movie, but when looking at it, it's just kind of like it just kind of falls into the abyss of the zombie genre because there's so many freaking many of these movies, and when looking at it, like there's probably a lot of other interesting zombie-esh like movies, and but the only thing different about this one is it's a real like true legitimate love story that tries to do any number of things that kind of feel like love stories. And so that's what ultimately I can enjoy about some of these things is ultimately to like I would love to kind of sift off of the brain of the person that either wrote this or like shot it to just see like where their brain was for kind of breaking these down to really have it be that oh yeah, like this scene was like Romeo and Juliet, and this scene was like this movie, and this scene was like that movie, and this is what we were trying to do. We were trying to break it all down into like film motifs or something like that to kind of honor some films that happened before that. There was even at one point they had like a DVD of a zombie like right next to R, which I thought was hilarious. Um, but yeah, so really I enjoy this movie, but at the end of the day, it's also kind of it's a very slow piece because we have it to be really relied heavily on like narration of ultimately R's character, and reasonably there's not like a huge action scene in this movie. Like there's not like if anything you could ultimately see the you could ultimately say like the battle towards the end could be like a big action kind of scene, but like I wish that there could have been like a lot more action like consistently sprinkled throughout this entire movie where like there was like always like there's always like a heart pounding moment coming on into this movie rather than it just kind of slowly like but I think the funniest part is when Julie is trying to be like a zombie. We have it to where R is telling her like look dead, and we have to where Julie is like going like this, and he's like too much. To where Julie is trying to like tailor it down, and he's just like all right. So like I think that moment is probably the best moment in this movie where Julie is looking like she's having a seizure, and R has to tell her it's like too much. Like there's some good moments in this movie, and there is also the moments where it's like kind of very romantic and kind of interesting and this and that. But anyways, that's all I wanted to say about this movie, Warm Bodies. I didn't think I'd ever probably review this film, just because I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, I'm not quite sure if I was going to review this one. But when looking at it, I'm like, well, this feels like a Valentine's Day kind of movie, like right around February. So ultimately, I was like, well, I cannot not try and review this film. Um, but anyways, I'm gonna get out of my way to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.